From the Toronto Star, I'm Sabah Itazaz, and this matters. I'm from a country that struggles with water resources. Before coming here, I could never have imagined that Canada, a first world country, could have a water problem. Except it does. It's 2021, and many in Canada's First Nations still don't have clean drinking water. And that's now part of a collaborative investigation called Clean Water Broken Promises. Concordia University's Institute of Investigative Journalism brought together 70 students from across 10 universities, professional journalists from 6 news outlets across Canada, and 2 years of extensive reporting on this. Despite a promise by the Trudeau government to have clean drinking water flowing through every Indigenous community by 2021, pouring more than $1 billion into the problem hasn't come close to solving it. This investigative series aims to look into why and what's the true toll of the water crisis on generations of First Nations communities. On today's episode, we talk to 2 members of the investigative team to discuss a little bit of this. Annie Burns-Pieper is the former managing editor of the Institute of Investigative Journalism at Concordia University, and Brittany Hobson is a reporter at APTN News. Hello, Annie. Hello, Brittany. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Annie, I want to start with you, and I want to start with the data. There seems to be an information barrier when trying to find out exactly what is the water quality situation in First Nations communities. Tell me more about that. I believe you made some attempts to get information.
Throughout the project, we were trying to sort of fill some gaps that had been observed in the first year of the Institute's reporting on water. So last year, the Institute looked at lead in water and basically was trying to gather some information about First Nations as well, and found that there was really a lack of information. So we were trying to, with our research on this project, fill some of those gaps, which is why we did the water operator survey. But what we found was that it was very hard to get information out of the government on these issues, partially because of COVID. A lot of our freedom of information requests were delayed and never returned ultimately. We're still waiting for them. And then there were also just some sort of dark holes when it came to data, like it just didn't exist. So I reported a story that was published in the Tyee that basically just looked at the fact that there was no health data on water-related illnesses and deaths on First Nations at any level. So the federal government wasn't keeping that, the provinces weren't keeping that. And so no institution I contacted could actually tell me how many people had gotten sick or died as a result of their water. And that was something we reported on specifically as a major data gap.
And is it correct that the IIJ submitted close to 190 information requests, and the majority of them, they've not been responded to?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So we have a big backlog there. And I think that reporters across the country were facing similar issues as a result of COVID. But, we were working on this for over a year. And even with that long time period, we weren't able to get our requests answered.
Brittany, I want to bring you into this. I know you came onto this investigation a little bit later, but I do want to ask you, with the lack of data that we're talking about, is it fair to say that the true toll of the water crisis in First Nations communities can't really be known in its entirety? And who does this lack of transparency affect?
Mujun, Anine, hello, thanks for having me. I would say that is very fair to say, and I point specifically, I didn't have anything to do with this story, but to what Annie was talking about previously with finding the health-related issues to water, the fact that they don't even track that. So there definitely is a lack of just how big this crisis is. I don't think at the ground level, because any members of First Nations communities that we spoke to could tell us basically what was going on in their community and attribute it to the water. I don't know. I don't even know if maybe the government realizes how big of an issue this is.
Annie, this has been a massive investigation that was undertaken in probably one of the most unusual of circumstances, right? How did you manage to do the reporting, such a massive undertaking in the middle of COVID-19? I'm sure it must have presented its own set of unique challenges.
When we embarked on this project, we anticipated that reporters and the students that were working on this project would be able to travel and visit the communities that we were researching. And that basically was taken completely off the table. Some of our TV reporters were able to visit some of the communities that we reported on, but it was sort of few and far between compared to what we had originally hoped for. So we just had to adapt. And like everybody working in, any job this year, we had to make changes to how we were working. And I think in some ways we would have been facing similar challenges either way, because our team is spread out across the country. And so we do have to do a lot of digital and calls and video calls just to coordinate with so many people. But I think the part that was the most challenging was really trying to build relationships over the phone. And I think, it was a struggle, and very understandably, to sort of make ourselves seem trustworthy over just, persistent phone calls. And I would say probably not the ideal way to go about this, but we were able to overcome that to tell some important stories, I think.
And obviously an investigation of this size and its extended rollout, as we've seen, it presents complex, nuanced issues, and we can't sum them up in 20 minutes. It wouldn't be fair. But is there anything from the findings that you think is sort of the crux of it, or anything that resounds with you in some way, Annie?
I think there was a few different themes that came out. I think one of sort of the main things that I think all of the stories get at is that, while there's been huge investment into water on First Nations, the way in which that money has been spent has not always served the community's needs. And I think that sort of our lead story talked about some of the issues there, and how an enduring colonial system is just not necessarily taking into account the local perspectives that are needed to really make these investments work for communities. So I think that was what we were trying to convey in all of our work. And we looked into some sort of specific issues within that, but that was the major takeaway. And I think that it's not something that we've, uncovered. I think that First Nations themselves are very well aware of this, but we're hoping to amplify that message with what we uncovered.
Let's talk about method a little bit. For this investigation, more than 100 interviews were conducted with actual water operators from these communities to try and get to the root of the problem. Tell me about these operators and why you chose this way to build up on your investigations.
Strategy, it was actually started before I came on board as the managing editor. And essentially, these are the people that are closest to the water system. So I think that was why the Institute decided to go that route. These are the people that are working on a day-to-day basis with water systems and really know the ins and outs of what happens when the power goes out, and, what it takes to get clean water to the community, what it means when a boil water advisory is in place. And so, although the plight of water operators has been reported on before, I think that what our series really did was get to a deeper understanding of the challenges that these people face and how that actually ultimately affects the systems that they're operating.
So you get that technical aspect, but also a lot of these water operators are from these communities. So their families are drinking this water that we're talking about. So there's that personal aspect as well, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And some places, these are really small communities, and these individuals feel a great responsibility to their community members and keeping everybody healthy and safe. What we showed in our stories was that these people are often underpaid and overworked. And so, while they carry around this large burden of protecting their communities, they're also stretched financially and not making what they would be making in a nearby municipality, for example.
Brittany, at what point of this project did you get involved? What communities were you working with? Share some of your experience with us and what sort of stood out to you.
Well, it was about a year ago, and I was actually brought on to look at stuff going on in Saskatchewan, but it was determined later on that I would look at Manitoba. I'm in Winnipeg and from Winnipeg. It was a difficult process because of COVID. That was not anything anyone was expecting. And originally, the community that I was looking at is in northern Manitoba, very remote, very isolated, and with the lack of clean drinking water and no kind of health infrastructure, there was concerns around COVID. So unfortunately, I kind of had to shift gears just because of the pandemic and not really being able to travel. But last fall in September, I was able to go to a community, Hollow Water First Nation, which is within driving distance Winnipeg. And it was the brief moment that Manitoba wasn't on a lockdown. So I was able to go to the community and, spend the day there, which was so important because like Annie had mentioned, you're dealing with communities that for years and years, especially with mainstream media, have really had people just, calling them or assuming and not really doing that groundwork. So it is very hard to build relationships. And also what you will find is once you get into a community, it may be hard to find people to talk prior, but once you're there, everyone wants to talk because it's maybe one of the few times that journalists are actually on the ground there. So it's always interesting when you go into a community because they see our APTN track and then they come up to us and they just want to share and share. So that's why it's so important. And I'm really glad that despite all of the kind of challenges that we were facing with COVID, we were able to at least go to one community in Manitoba here.
Being face-to-face and in person kind of builds that extra layer of trust, right?
Well, and it does. And one of the subjects that I interviewed, I had spoken with her beforehand and it was decided. But, once I got to her place, I had to sit with her for probably a good 45 minutes just to talk things out, which is completely fair. And she had concerns. She's like, I've been interviewed in the past and people have misconstrued things and whatnot. And you really had to kind of just sit and listen. And that's what I did. And I told her, I'm just going to do the best that I can do, but really to build that comfort level.
We'll be right back. While you were there, you did a lot of reporting about the water systems, especially these water systems called cisterns that are mostly used in rural and remote locations like reserves, right? And this is not directly linked to your reporting, but in the course of this investigation, there was a link found to COVID-19 and the communities that use cisterns, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about this water system in particular?
So cisterns are more commonly known as water tanks, are essentially, large water tanks that sit on each individual's property and it's connected to their home. And a water truck comes and delivers water. It varies by community, but this can happen, sometimes only once a week, up to, 2 to 3 times a week. It does vary. But the issue with cisterns is that the water is, quote unquote, clean because the water that's coming out of the water treatment plant is supposed to be clean, but there can be contamination from the transport to getting it in the water tank. Debris can get in there. We heard of even dead animals getting in these water tanks. Water tanks aren't being cleaned properly or often enough. So that was kind of what one of the stories I was looking at was, this is supposed to be, under the government's eyes, a way to get clean water to communities and a solution when that actually is not the case.
And it seems that about 15% of First Nations households rely on cisterns.
Yes, and a large portion, like you had mentioned, they are kind of in the prairie. It's a prairie issue, but Manitoba has the largest percentage of First Nations that rely on them.
We're speaking of the government. I want to bring Annie in here. We know that more than $1.74 billion has been spent on water projects, wastewater projects in the past 5 years. It's 2021, and yet we're still talking about the problems that still persist despite all of this money that's been going in. Why?
I think sort of going back to the point that I raised before is that, yes, a large amount of money has been spent, but it hasn't always been spent in ways that serves the community's needs, I think is what all of our investigations have found. And I think something else that we reported on extensively, and Brittany and I worked on this together, was the issue of the firms that are getting the jobs to sort of build these large water treatment plants. And we found that the firms, sometimes aren't best suited to do this work. And we found that there are sometimes companies that are involved in this work and taking advantage of this federal money that may not be working in the best interest of First Nations. And I think that as a result of our investigation, the government's taking a closer look at that now to sort of keep track of if a company does a bad job in one community, that it doesn't go on to get another job in another community. So we've gotten some indication from the federal government that they're going to be looking at that area, although it's going to require some follow-up reporting to see what actual concrete steps have been taken.
So in response to some of your investigative work, there might be some oversight in the future.
Correct, yeah.
Brittany, I want to ask you the same thing as well. As of January 2021, 39 First Nations communities are coping with long-term boil water advisories. And I know that's only part of the problem that First Nations communities face in terms of the water crisis. Why is this still happening? And how do you think racism and colonial structures, as Annie also mentioned, that continues to play a role in impeding any development here?
In terms of the boil water advisories, as federal government, that has been a promise from day one since they got into office. But I think one of the issues is that they really have just looked at it as it's just a boil water advisory problem when that's not necessarily the case. There are many communities who are on a number of short-term boil water advisories. There are a number of communities that are dealing with infrastructure that they're not equipped to, but it may not equate itself to long-term boil water advisories. So when they're looking at it this way, they're really only looking at one thing and believing that maybe that is going to solve all the water problems when that's not actually what's always going on in communities. So I think that in terms of the colonial structures, well, I mean, Indigenous Services Canada was a department set up a long time ago, decades ago, under a different name, but with this idea that First Nations communities couldn't properly govern themselves. So, the federal government had to do that work. And so with that mindset, it really was kind of more of a top-down approach. And it was like, well, we know what's best for these communities. You don't know what's best. So I think that that's been a really hard way of thinking, I guess, to reverse. And so there are lots of policies that are still in existence today that reflect that. And so, we've heard leaders say consistently that they've told, Indigenous Service Canada that this is what they want, or they don't want this, and only to be told, well, no, this is what you're getting.
It's a multi-layered question, but what would it take to heal Indigenous people's distrust for the water after this long history of trauma associated with it?
Honestly, I don't know at this point because, I asked a lot of the people that I spoke with, if you had gotten, clean, even if you were hooked up to a central water line, especially with the people that are on cisterns, like, would you still drink the water? And a lot of people said no, they wouldn't. They don't trust these systems after, entire lifetimes for some families of dealing with not getting clean drinking water. And it's just something that they've come to live with, to accept, and they've built it into their lives of, having to purchase bottled water so that they can safely drink water. So, I don't know if that trust is something that we're going to see in my lifetime, but I don't think that means it's not something to work towards.
Why is it important to conduct this kind of research, this kind of investigation on a national scale?
Many people could have looked at our investigation and said, people have already, done this research and done investigations into this. But I think it's a persisting story. And, if we're able to uncover new ways in which policies are failing communities, I think that that's a public service. And that's what the Institute was sort of set up to do, is to put voice to those types of issues. So I think, until this problem is solved, it's still a story.
Brittany, what do you feel should be the takeaway from all of this extensive reporting work, all of this investigations, all of this information that's coming out as a result? To you, what do you think should be the takeaway from this?
We so often hear, it's 2021. How does this keep happening? And I really, as we've kind of went over, in this conversation, there are a lot of reasons why this is still happening. And I just hope that maybe for non-Indigenous folks, they get a better understanding of why and why billions of dollars are not doing anything to fix this water crisis. So I really hope that, they get a better understanding of what's going on. And then for the communities that we spoke to and the people that are living this every day, I hope that they feel that in some way they were represented, in some way their concerns were heard, and in some way they saw the work and saw basically just trying to represent them and put real, actual people at the forefront of this reporting, because that's what it comes down to. We hear so often that there's these communities that are dealing with unsafe drinking water, but when it comes down to it's families, it's mothers with young babies who have rashes because they're bathing in dirty water. So I hope that they see themselves represented in this reporting.
Well, Annie, Brittany, kudos to you and everyone involved in this, taking such a massive project and doing it so well. It was great reporting. And thank you so much for being on the podcast and for sharing your insight and reporting with us.
Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
I was speaking to Annie Burns-Pieper, former managing editor of the Institute of Investigative Journalism, and Brittany Hobson, who's a reporter at APTN News. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Sabai Tazaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Munter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattendon, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So-Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.